Interviews. An interview is a face-to-face conversation between the researcher and the subject of the research. It has many advantages over questionnaires, as the interviewer knows they are speaking to the right person. They can explain questions which the respondent does not understand, and people find it harder to reject being interviewed than throwing away a questionnaire, so the response rate is higher. Interviews may be structured or formal. That is, all the respondents are asked identical questions in exactly the same order. This type of interview is favoured by positivist sociologists, who seek to measure society and generate statistical data. They believe that because the research experience is identical for each respondent, differences in their answers reflect the real differences in society that the sociologist is interested in. Rather than seeking to measure society, interpretive sociologists want to understand how individual people make sense of the world around them. They believe that interviews should be unstructured, that is, they should be more informal, a sort of guided conversation, where the respondent can describe their views and social experiences in their own words, with a little prompting from the researcher. Some sociologists also interview respondents in groups. Paul Willis did this in his classic study Learning to Labour, and more recently Mack and Gale in his study The Making of Men. Each type of interview will now be considered in turn. Firstly, structured interviews. A researcher would draw up an interview schedule containing a large number of closed, pre-coded questions as the basis of the interview. Interviewers will ring the answer given or place a tick in a box. Shades of opinion may be gathered by inviting the interviewee to assess their feelings from strongly agree to strongly disagree, normally with 3 categories in between. There are a number of advantages to using structured interviews. The interview schedule can be used by any number of different interviewers in a wide range of places, since the information collected will be the same. This means a large sample of people in different parts of the country can be interviewed. This, and the fact that the interview experience is identical for all respondents, ensures that the data collected is reliable. This means that any future research using the same interview schedule will show the same result. Another advantage is that it is relatively quick and easy to generate statistical data from the pre-coded answers. It is merely a matter of counting the numbers. Also, the formal nature of the interview means that the interviewers need little training, and their chance of influencing the respondent's answers is very much less than it could be in an unstructured interview. However, there are disadvantages also. The fact that the interview schedule is set by the researcher may mean that important topics are left out of the research. Thus, classic sociologist Bill White spoke during his participant observation of learning answers to questions he would not have had the sense to ask. Indeed, the selection of questions may reflect the researcher's values, and it's possible to use loaded language or leading questions. However, the researcher will publish the questions used in the study, and this allows critical assessment of the interview schedule. Also, there is some evidence that interviewees seek to please the researcher and try to give their perception of the right answer. In a formal interview, it may be very difficult to ascertain if the respondent is deliberately lying or exaggerating their answer to shock or impress. There may be specific checking questions in a subsequent part of the interview, and there may be a place on the interview schedule where the interviewer can indicate that they doubt the truth of the answers they have been given. However, an interviewer may not follow up an interesting lead. This must be left for future research. Now we come to unstructured interviews. In this type of interview, the researcher is aiming to encourage the respondent to describe experiences in their own words, so any direct questions will be open and allow a number of possible answers. Interpretive sociologists believe this allows the respondent total flexibility to decide on important issues and give a detailed opinion. This overcomes the agenda setting of the formal interview and gives considerably more detail about the subject of the study, but it is time-consuming and difficult to analyse. These interviews are recorded, and the researcher may need to listen to each interview a number of times to extract the information they require. For example, in one study, analysing each 1-hour interview took 17 hours. It is also true that the researcher will need to interpret long answers. and here it is possible that another researcher would have a different opinion about that answer. Clearly, it is even more important for these guided conversations that the interviewer is well trained, since the informality of the interview could make it easier for the researcher to influence the respondent's answers, a problem known as interviewer bias. However, the problem can be greater than that. In an American study of children's speech patterns in Harlem, it was found that the class and ethnicity of the interviewer affected the children's willingness to speak, and therefore the results obtained. The issue was not whether or not the interviewer had been trained, rather the freedom with which the child felt they could speak. Informal interviews may be especially good for researching sensitive subjects, since the interviewer can build a rapport with their respondent, and this trust may enable the researcher to gain insight into difficult or painful events. However, even this may be too problematic, and in a recent study of domestic violence, respondents were handed laptop computers to record certain parts of their information. In informal interviews, the researcher will have designated areas they wish to cover, and they have the flexibility to omit obviously inappropriate areas or questions. As a result, each interview is a unique event which cannot be replicated. Furthermore, the time involved in each interview and the analysis of the resulting recording makes this an expensive method, and thus sample sizes are small. It is possible for the researcher's values to influence the interpretation of the interview recordings, and this bias would be far less obvious than for formal interviews. Because of these problems, positivist sociologists question the reliability of such work. However, interpretive sociologists believe this type of interview is more likely to be valid, that is, to give a true picture. Feminists are critical of formal interviews because they regard it as a masculine process where the respondent is disempowered and required to answer only those questions that the researcher deems important. They favour a more conversational style of approach, and Oakley, in her work on childbirth, regarded her correspondents as collaborators, equal partners in the research. Thus, they would telephone her with information, and she became so close to some of her pregnant mothers that she was actually there when their children were born. This, she believed, gave the most in-depth insight possible to the lives of her respondents. However, this is a long way from the idea of a neutral interviewer, trained not to react to their subjects. So far we have considered formal and informal interviews as though sociologists would use one or the other for theoretical reasons. In reality, there is considerable sociological research which uses a mixture of the two methods in a process called semi-structured interviews. This enables the researcher to obtain the benefits of both methods. Thus, straightforward statistical data such as gender, ethnicity, and age can be collected through specifically targeted questions, and more in-depth answers sought in a more conversational style. A semi-structured interview could also take the form of a carefully guided conversation using open questions or with specific prompts planned in advance. Now we come to group interviews. These may enable the researcher to see the impact of the group situation on individuals and to understand how the group interacts. The power balance in a group interview is different. The researcher is in less direct control, and this may empower the group to speak more freely. Willis argued that respondents may feel more comfortable in a group, and therefore more likely to reveal information they would hesitate to disclose to an individual interviewer. A focus group can be selected, and can be asked to discuss a particular issue. Normally, the researcher introduces the topic and then encourages the group to discuss it, taking action only to ensure the group does not drift too far from the desired research topic. This type of informal group interview is quite common in modern sociological research. So what can we conclude from all this? There are both theoretical and practical reasons for the selection of any research method, and interviews are no exception. Positivists favour formal, structured interviews, and interpretivists favour informal, unstructured ones. Each type of interview may be used in conjunction with the other. It can be productive to start with a small number of unstructured interviews, and use the information collected to construct a more formal interview schedule. A set of formal interviews may suggest an area requiring further research, which may be done through informal, unstructured interviews. Also, combining both types of research may allow sociologists to benefit from the advantages of each. A researcher may wish to study people in individual and group situations, and may use a combination of focus groups, formal and informal interviews in this process. Interviewing is a flexible sociological method which can be used successfully in many ways in sociological research.